Thank you.
Thank you very much, Regina. And we've now got time for some questions to Rupert and Regina about what we've been listening to, what they've been explaining to us. Does anybody have any questions? Now is the time to turn on your mic and to speak. Or again, you can send questions in the chat if you're a little bit reticent about speaking. Perhaps to kick things off, I've received a couple of chat messages that from newcomers to the EODEM project, and actually there's an issue. They seem to be gravitating around a question which requires us to take a step back. Some people are pointing out that the requirements in different institutions, different operators can be very different. Institutions don't have the same loan forms and the same requirements. Yet you seem to have been able to consolidate these requirements into a fairly coherent use case, one that you were able to define precisely as a set of data requirements. Perhaps you could say something, Rupert, and possibly Regina as well, about how easy it was or how difficult it was to consolidate what's a seemingly complex issue into something relatively cut and dried.
It was a long process. If those of you who saw our introduction yesterday would have seen Maya's talk, where she went through the sort of various meetings we've had to get to this point. The key one was at the conference, the CIDOC conference in Tbilisi, where we workshopped pulling together those units of information. And then we revised those in Heraklion in collaboration with the system vendors. In a sense, the kinds of things that museums require or need to stipulate in a loan are broadly similar, which is how the object will be kept, how it'll be handled and transported, how it'll be displayed, and how it will be insured or indemnified. Now, the various requirements for individual kinds of object differ significantly, but those sort of basic headings are fairly standard. And for things like couriering, for example, the National Gallery, until COVID put a stop to it, we insisted upon our courier accompanying every object. Other organizations will be quite happy to share a courier, either for the whole installation, whole transport and installation, or just for the transport. Others don't insist on a courier at all. That's fine. That is simply a transport requirement as far as we're concerned. And so the courier requirements can go in that field. What we've tried to do is be as lightweight as possible whilst still providing all the information that we do. So we've not deliberately worried about the reproduction that is or is not allowed of an image of the object in whatever context, and that it strikes us goes beyond the kind of core requirements of being able to define what needs to be done to get the object from A to B and on the wall, or in the case in that borrower's institution, and back safely.
Rupert, maybe you could also say a few words about the granularity of the information at this point. I think it would also clarify the question.
In the spirit of keeping it properly lightweight, you've seen that we've got quite a lot of information listed on the slide. I think there was sort of, if you take groups as just one piece of information, there are about 35 units of information. Of those, if you ignore the ones that are kind of system things or standards like the institution's name, that can be added when that object, when the record is exported, that are the same for every item, then all we ask for is, I'm trying to remember now what the mandatory fields are, but it's an object type, an object title or name, an object identifier, in other words, its accession or inventory number, and mandated by LIDO is whether or not the record that's being exchanged describes a group of objects or a single object. And that again may be something that can be dropped in on export. So we only need you to supply very little information. The more you can supply, the better. But we want this specifically to be something that is potentially easy to implement. So a vendor can say that they implement LIDO if they only export those 4 units of information. Equally, that's still a help. That's still a bit less typing that somebody at the far end has to do. Now, if somebody can provide all the units of information, then that's absolutely wonderful. And that's much, 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 much less typing that somebody needs to do at the far end. But we don't insist on it. So we do want to make this as lightweight to implement, both in terms of the data that the individual museums assemble and in terms of the work that we're insisting on developers doing to actually implement the system.
Thank you, Rupert. There is a question in the... Oh, sorry, Regine, you had something to add?
Yeah, might just add one aspect, Rupert. I think what was also helpful in this aspect is the display index structure in LIDO, which allows also different systems to handle the information either as free text or as structured information. Of course, structured information is in many cases more informative, or from a system point of view easier to handle, but still it's possible to transmit also just free text information.
Yeah. So those the structured information that I showed you for I think it was light exposure, that can be, we will happily just take the string, or you could just have a string that says 55 lux. That's fine. That's acceptable. Or you don't have it at all. I mean, that's equally acceptable as long as you can give us the basic object information. That's still a help. There's a related question in the chat, which is about installation instructions, and particularly for contemporary art. So where would we put that? Hardware, software, spatial and technical dependencies. That goes as a slug of text in the installation method EODEM unit of information. And that can be as long or as short as you like.
Do we have any other questions? I can't see any hands being raised. Okay, well, thank you very much for those remarks and your pellucid presentation. And so let's move on to the next section. We're going to hear now from the vendors perspective. So perhaps this is the vendors POV, as Rupert, it was put in the notes. Okay, so I think Jette is going to tell us something about what this looks like, what this whole process looks like from the vendor's point of view, trying to implement this and make something that actually works. So, Jette.
Thank you. Yes, sincerely, of course, we participated in the working group, and Rupert was part of it since the beginning, probably. And for us, it's not done now with the publication of a standard and profile, but of course, it should be integrated into the system, and not only Museum Plus developed by SETCOM, but also other systems, so that we can really enable the users to interchange their data between Museum Plus and all other systems available which integrate it. So the main point here now is to get anyone interested and who can do it to implement it, to integrate it into their systems. So generally, as Rupert said, there are many systems already having the possibility to export LIDO done during the OpenAI Insight project or other projects. So generally, to export EODEM, it's not a huge step, or shouldn't be a huge step for most of the software providers, as you just need to extend the current export to the EODEM requirements. So we have done the first steps for that in Museum Plus already, of course, based on the draft versions of LIDO version 1.1 and EODEM, which are published now. And also about the import, because the export alone is not usable. You have LIDO, but you want to re-import the data that you get from another museum, for example, when doing a loan or preparing a loan. And the main issues or the questions that need to be answered here are not the EODEM details and structures, which are clear, but where to put the information. So every system is different, and also how the system is used is different from museum to museum, of course. So you get either very granular data, so having a lot of object requirements, looks requirements, temperature, different temperature requirements, but you may also get very textual data. So you need to find a way to get the data into the system so that it helps the users, so that they do not need to type, but just click a button, hopefully, and that they get the most of it. So the most of the EODEM data delivered to them, but not wrong data. So you need to find a way to insert the values coming from EODEM into the different systems. And what I see as the task for the next time is that all the system vendors and the users share and create data to see the outcomes of exchanging data, even on test cases, to see, okay, how far can we get, where can we do some better things during export and import, where can we use open web vocabularies as much as possible to have a joint basis for the delivery and interchange of data, and where may we need some extensions to the definitions or to the LIDO terminology or other terminologies used. So for me, that's the main point. So get everyone into working and using LIDO and EODEM, and also to deepen the understanding of both LIDO and EODEM. And I think Richard may add there, because I think one of the good results also from the whole working group is having a kind of preview of EODEM data, because many users may have heard about LIDO but are not fluent in reading XML. So maybe Richard could have some additions to that.
Okay, yes. One thing that I did as a sort of contribution to the project was to actually write an XSLT style sheet, and the idea of this style sheet is to take the XML format of an EODEM transfer and actually render it in a browser so that it actually comes out looking nice on the screen. Now that wasn't enough to entertain me, so I did some other things as well. I've been involved with another software package, one called Modes, which is widely used in the UK. And so what I did was to try and take some sample records. So Jette produced some sample records, and Rupert produced an epic sample record from the National Gallery. And these were in the EODEM format. So my challenge was to take those as an input and see if I could convert them into a format that would load into the Modes software. And so I wrote an XSLT transform to do that. And having got the data into modes, I then thought, well, it'd be useful to be able to get the data back out. So I wrote another XSLT transform to take the mode's native object format data and export it back out as an EODEM file. And so my objective was that when the data came back out of modes, it should look as far as possible the same as it had looked before it went in, so that you could take the data and round trip it into the software and back out again, and not actually have any information lost. So if I share my screen, which, as we discovered yesterday, means that I will shortly have to leave the meeting in order to see you all again, ever again, but it works at least starting this. So if I go to here, particularly if I click that. Okay, right, so that's a view of the National Gallery record once it had arrived in the modes environment. And you can see there that although the data looks familiar, or at least it will look familiar to Rupert, it's actually structured differently from the original EODEM format. So if I go over here, so that is the XML I started with, and you will recognize that much more as a standard LIDO record. You'll also, the keen-eyed amongst you will notice the second line of that file is an XML style sheet reference. And by putting that reference in there, it means that that document will be automatically transformed when it's introduced to a browser, so that it comes out in a nicely formatted view, which, if my
Richard's fears seem to have been realized, and he has frozen. Unfortunately.
Oh, it's the revenge of Linux.
I suppose Richard will be getting back to us as soon as he can. While we're waiting for Richard to pop up again, I've got a little quick question to ask about the import process. This is for Jette, and perhaps for Rupert as well, and maybe even Regine. Is it a requirement that all the EODEM data be imported into a software package? You mentioned that there's a certain degree of redundancy between structured data and free text data. Does all of that have to be importable, or is it acceptable to say import the structured version and not the free text? Jette.
Yeah, principally it's not a mandatory requirement, of course, because it depends on the system's granularity for the different aspects of data. So many systems may have very granular information about measurements like the size and weight, and height, and 3D dimensions of an object, but may not have a detailed section and database fields for the object requirements, like looks and 24 hours looks and maximum looks and so on. So there the main goal is to import as much information, of course, as possible, which is delivered, but not to force neither the system providers nor the users to introduce new fields to their systems, because the users also, they want to stay with their data management and their rules how to record data, but of course they have the positive side of getting foreign data into their system without having to adapt to it. So LIDO does not want, or EODEM does not want, to force any changes how data is cataloged. But of course, if you can establish a way to import granular data or even granular data besides of textual description. This should help. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that point. Richard doesn't seem to be around right away, so I think we'll sort of strike up the question and answer, the free question and answer session. Maya.
I was wondering, Jette, are you prepared to show your part today? Because you had a push of the button yesterday.
Okay.
Do you manage to pull out those slides?
Yes, I can do so. So you should see my screen right now. Not yet. I'm sorry.
Not yet. Yes.
Now
Yes.
you can see it. So this is the insight into a Museum Plus test application where I implemented both an export of EODEM data and also a draft alpha version of an EODEM import. So what you see is a module to import the data which could be given a name like CIDOC 2020, and which could be given an import file, which is an EODEM format. And here we also have some kind of config file, which means mapping the data and the information coming from the EODEM structure to the Museum Plus database structure. So what needs to be done here when you get a new EODEM file is to simply click the button here, blue, Start Import. And after a short while, hopefully it says that the import started and the import is completed. So this is everything which happens. You do not need to interfere with the system or the data. And if I go back to the Museum Plus main module, I search for the newly imported EODEM file, which I can see here. It has been imported just right now. And we can see the base information and most of the details delivered, not everything yet, but a lot of, so you don't see an image yet. I have to work on that. But you see an artist maker information, title, different numbers, the description, of course, and also many object requirements like the temperature, looks, and filming photography and installation details that were delivered in the National Gallery example file. So here we really have details from a completely different collection management systems imported to Museum Plus. And of course, the goal would be that we will also have the possibility to import other systems data to Museum Plus in the same way. So here there's one difference to the modes implementation. Of course, we are also dealing with XML. The EODEM is a XML standard now. And we do not transform the data by an XSLT here, but still we have to do some kind of mapping and transfer in between, which we do with our system's background implementation and using XPath to address the different XML structures and elements and to tell them where they go in the Museum Plus database. Yes, I hope that clarified and showed the main super goal of having a button which is pushed and then everything works like magic. But there's still work to do. But still it is manageable and doable, and it's quite a lot of the information which is coming from the National Gallery here, which we can see, and it's promising. I hope to be able to proceed with that. Yes.
Thank you very much, Jette, for sharing that with us. Regine, did I see you raising your hand?
I was just clapping. Very nice to see that.
You were clapping.
Very happy to. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Could I ask you, Jette? I mean, what was the sort of the work involved from your side of things? I mean, was this a difficult, arduous, complicated thing to do, or was it really dead easy and you did it on the bus on the way home, or somewhere in between?
There are two parts of it. So on one side, of course, it is the implementation, technical implementation. As I'm working for SETCAM and Museum Plus, I know the background technical requirements, but still I needed the help of some of the background developers to do such data import. But yeah, it is work in progress and proceeding, and quite good results yet already, but now I need to go back to the other part of the job, and which is probably the more complicated, or the one where you need more brains, is to really follow the definition of the different EODEM and LIDO elements. So you need to know what you're doing and what you're putting where, and this needs to be decided carefully so that you don't simply put the title in the artist's field and so on. So you really need to understand and read the documentation and put it to the use case. So this is also the most general thing. You won't ever be able to implement an EODEM import without taking care of LIDO in general. So you have to get into it as a software vendor. Yeah. Also, Richard is back.
Yes, I've returned. I apologize, everyone. My machine locked up totally. I had to reboot it. Yeah, I mean, with the modes environment, we have quite a generic sort of structure for the data, and there's lots of flexibility. So mapping the DEM data to the data structure was relatively straightforward. It certainly wasn't, a direct one-to-one link, everything mapping neatly to one other place, but I was able to treat the transfer in a reasonably coherent manner, and I did manage to find places. It was particularly the collections management related, the object requirement type information that was the most challenging to find a home for within modes, because as with many systems, modes is primarily designed for object cataloging and for details of the object itself. So the idea of object requirements is not something which we would routinely be expecting to record in modes. So it's not that well served within the structure. But certainly something that I realized was that many of our users would probably actually hold that sort of requirements information somewhere other than in their object records, that they would have a separate place where that information would live, so that they would have requirements for different types of objects, so maybe fine art requirements or natural history requirements, but they would be the same whichever natural history objects were being lent. So you'd simply pull this standard requirement information across and insert it into the EODEM record that you were creating. So it's made us think in the context of our system where to actually most usefully keep the different bits of information that would be required for effective use of EODEM as a transfer mechanism.
Richard, glad to see you back online. If I can ask you a question, you mentioned before you skipped out, you said your goal was to arrive at a round trip import-export where the data that came out was as close as possible to the data that went in. How close do you think you are to achieving that goal? I mean,
I think I pretty much did, actually. In writing my transform, I put in a set of asterisks that would appear alongside any data which I had failed to actually deal with in my style sheet. And then my goal was to try and produce a result where there weren't any asterisks left. So I then knew I'd dealt with everything somehow. And so that was my challenge on the import side. And having got the data in, I then had a LIDO export, which I had in fact developed before for the Art UK project. And so I used that as a starting point and pushed the data out and then visually compared it with the original record. And well, it added the best part of another week to the exercise, but I did eventually get to the point where I felt that the re-exported National Gallery EODEM record was pretty much functionally identical to the one I had started with. So yes, I mean, obviously that is just one sample record. It's very comprehensive, and you know, if you're trying to set up working systems, we'll probably have more work to do to actually pick out all the more obscure corners of the EODEM framework, which have not yet been exercised by the sample records we've been working with. Because I've been very much just been working with the data rather than to try and do a complete mapping of absolutely anything that possibly could be sent through. But yeah, I was actually very pleased with where I managed to get with that. And as I was saying yesterday, I'm very happy to share the style sheets I've developed, although obviously they are designed to transform data into the modes object XML format, and therefore that's not necessarily useful as a result for anybody else. But the logic of the style sheets sort of taking the elements of EODEM and then deciding where to put them, as Jette said, I mean, she's using XPath to achieve the same thing, specifying where in your target system this data has to go. But the style sheets at least show the way I've actually broken the problem down into lots of individual templates, each addressing one part of the structure. So it's simply that if you started with that style sheet, you would then put the result somewhere different that worked for your system.
Jette, do you feel confident that you've achieved the same sort of level of functional identity, so that data going in, data coming out is functionally equivalent?
One of the next steps to also try, if we import data and we export it into, see where are the differences and where could we achieve the most similar things. So data should be lost and having those round trips, or at least the important data for the users if the system should be lost. And generally, yes, most of the details should be exportable for such a round trip. The issues arise there where we do not have the granularity which has been delivered. For example, in the example data set from the National Gallery, also here from Museum Plus, it's the object requirements, which are not the typical example of which are cataloged in such a detail, but still, if you can import the textual description of such details, then you can also export them. So a round trip principally should be possible, yes.
Rupert.
Yeah, if I could just add that actually, in a sense, it shouldn't be a round trip, because there's information that is generic at the lender's end. So that may actually include the requirements. I mean, at the National Gallery, we've got paintings on panel and paintings on canvas, and that's pretty much it. And each of those will have a fairly standard set of requirements. Plus, there's the generic information about the lender, and probably things like your insurance requirements are generic for all objects. And so those conceivably sit in a single table that are kind of the museum's standards for. But on the consuming system, the borrower needs to have those tied to every object, because they will vary from every object, because each lender will have slightly different requirements for every object. So it's not quite circular.
No, I think the reason I did this, Rupert, was to exercise the export mechanism, because having got your record into the mode system, that was by far the most detailed example I had to work with. So it was the obvious thing to try and export. But as I said, that did actually raise questions in my own mind as to where I should be getting this data from, and the realization that in practice it probably wouldn't actually be in the object record, although that's where obviously it ended up after importing it into modes.
Yeah, and obviously it's a useful exercise to go through to check that your imports and your exports are effectively doing the same thing.
I think it's interesting, Rupert, that you should pick up on that this round trip is not a use case. obviously, and that I think that highlights your focus as somebody working in the museum rather than on the technical end of things. And I understand entirely Richard's and Jette's desire to do a round trip to check that everything's working properly, but it's a different sort of perspective, different concern. There are actually one or two questions, some interesting questions turning up in the chat. I was wondering if you could take a look at those. There's one from Patrick McDonough about the Museum Plus configuration interface. Is that something you could, actually we don't have a lot of time left, but is that something that is visible? Can you share it with us? Can't hear you yet. Jette, you're muted. Well, we can see it, Jette, but we can't hear you.
Okay. No, now you should hear me. I'm sorry.
Yes, that's good.
I just opened and shared my Museum Plus tests again. So where we have general exporting possibilities in Museum Plus in the standard. Also there you may find or you may integrate the EODEM export. So it's basically working exactly like any other export to Word, PDF, or Excel. And as soon as you click it, and I didn't show that yesterday, but I'm not sure. Oh, nice. The browser makes some extra work. It should export the draft version of the EODEM file in XML standard directly. So we see there is some kind of round trip happening already. So the title and other details are there already. And yeah, even the object requirements. So the base principle of exporting EODEM is the same as for any other exports. Besides of course, that we here also use XSLT for transforming the general XML export, which comes from the database, to the EODEM standard.
Thank you very much for sharing that with us, Jette, and I'm glad it didn't crash your computer.
No.
That only happens to me, that's all right.
Well, it's Rupert's slugs of XML that do it, you know. You have to put anti-slug pellets down to protect your computer. Actually, I think we've pretty much run out of time now. There's another session starting shortly, so we'll have to wind things up. I'd like to thank everybody who's been taking part for organizing this and for contributing. I'd like to thank you all, particularly also for sticking to your time limits and for explaining things so precisely in such a restricted time frame. I think that's really appreciable. It shows a lot of preparations work has been going on, and it's great to see that this project has made such a lot of progress. I remember participating in the workshop in Heraklion, and I was particularly struck by the level of enthusiasm of all the vendors, and you feel that I mean, it doesn't perhaps come through when you're looking at slugs of XML, but there's a real enthusiasm to get this thing working, which is great, and it's heartwarming and encouraging, I think, to see that this project is making headway, and we've got a real sense of cooperation and collaboration emerging in this field. And finally, we might actually be able to drag museums into the 20th century, screaming and kicking, and stop people from rekeying data. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? So thank you very much, everybody, for taking part. I hope you found it as interesting as I have. And there is a recording of this session, so you'll be able to look back at it and go over things again if you missed something, or indeed if your computer crashed briefly while you were watching us. Thanks, everybody. Maya, do you want to say anything? Closing remarks?
Well, just a couple of practical remarks as usual. We promised to our colleagues who are in the following session to close 5 to 10 minutes earlier, so that they would have a little bit of extra time for the technical setup. So that's why we are closing rather 5 minutes early than 5 minutes after. And I'm thanking you all for keeping the schedule, and thank you for sending the messages. Please do keep sending them. We will collect the messages and try to answer to them either individually or through the documentation standards working group web pages.